This is the first of a pair of screencasts based upon new capabilities within Lightroom through recently added photo merge technology, allowing for users to build both multi-frame panoramas and HDR images without having to hand off to either Photoshop or third-party applications as in the case of HDRs. I was never much impressed with Photoshop's HDR builder, HDR Pro, and have always found my favorite HDR building software, Nik's HDR Pro 2, though certainly providing users more control over the look of the final export from within its interface, still a challenge to work with consistently outputting realistic-looking HDRs. You can always tell you're looking at an HDR, even one built with the intention of looking realistic, when looking at a Nik or certainly a Photomatic's rendering. Call me a crank, but the bloom has long been off the rose for me with oversaturation and uber tone mapping, so very stereotypical of HDR images today. I know I'm not the only one looking for the high dynamic range rendering results our eyes provide us, the ability to see detail in shadows and highlights as we walk through the world around us. How about the ability for us to render images like that? Well, now we can, all within Lightroom, and even more remarkably, by utilizing another feature specific to the application, working with its virtual copies when building HDRs. Best of all, I believe, building HDRs within Lightroom creates for me the most realistic high dynamic range images of any other option I've been working with over the past few years. This screencast is based upon experimentation I've been engaged in this past year as I build a portfolio of conceptual photo illustrations in tandem with a new site I'm designing for myself. Recent Lightroom training sessions I've had assisting a client learn to better tame a pair of HDR building apps he's been utilizing for his real estate photography business, and a timely conversation I had just the other day with a good friend of mine, a film director called Hugh Harkness I met years ago in London while I was there showing producers and directors examples of my work as a location scout in the American West. Hugh had recently returned from a trip to the U.S. where he shot lots of remarkable pictures. His observations of towns and cities, landscapes, and people he came upon here in America this time around. One photograph he shared with me was a panorama he built in Lightroom, a wide expanse of the Pennsylvania countryside as summer begins here in the United States. Somehow, as we bounced emails back and forth, we got onto the subject of HDR, and he asked whether I thought this landscape shot in very flat or soft sunlight filtered through early morning mist and a bit of cloud cover would be a good candidate for having shot a series of bracketed exposures instead, the process normally employed to build an HDR image. Hugh had only shot one frame for each, handheld, as he and his wife were out on a walk through the countryside at sunrise when he came upon this landscape and hadn't taken along a tripod. His question about whether or not a soft-lit image being worthy of that treatment rather than the more typically dramatic light examples exhibited in online galleries showcasing HDR, plus his explanation he'd only shot one frame for each of the 8 or so images needed for his panorama, jogged my memory of a series I shot a decade ago in Monument Valley. These panorama sets have languished in my archive for several reasons. First, that late afternoon I arrived, there was a heavy cloud cover, and anyone who has spent much time making photographs in a desert knows that that landscape only really comes alive when there is direct sunlight on the mesas, the rough-hewn sandstone or granite cliffs, the spare trees and shrubs and grasses, and in their current state they simply had not inspired me to spend much time with them. Second, in my rush to cover as much ground as possible in the few hours left remaining for me to make the 17-mile loop and thoughtfully compose my panoramas, I somehow managed to underexpose the entire set of nearly 200 photographs by a full stop or two. Thank goodness these were all raw images, and one can do miracles in an editor like Lightroom under circumstances like this. Had they been JPEGs only, I would certainly have lost all my time and effort there, so each of these single exposures are a bit problematic and would require work more than the vast majority of pictures I shoot. Until my conversation with you the other day, I had just decided to store this collection and forget them for the time being. Anyway, this is a panorama I built in Photoshop a while back, just to give me an idea of what the original 8 frames I shot would eventually generate. Because I had once before experimented with making HDR images out of a single frame camera raw capture, then stitching together a series to eventually make a remarkable 6-frame panorama, I thought I'd make a screencast for my friend to illustrate the process to him. Now, Photo Merge was introduced back in 2015 and the release of Lightroom 6, providing a pair of multiple photo merging features previously available only within Photoshop itself. The ability to merge several images to HDR, enabling Lightroom users to build high dynamic range images within Lightroom, never leaving the application itself, instead of handing over the files as an export into Photoshop or another application in order to complete the HDR process as in the past. And, likewise, the ability to do pretty much the same, all within Lightroom again, merging 2 to however many images into a seamless panorama. What makes the process via Photo Merge in Lightroom such a game changer in my mind is that one can use Lightroom's unique feature, virtual copies, as part of each operation. To help you better understand why this is so remarkable, I just want to review with those who aren't all that familiar with virtual copies what they are. Even though virtual copies will appear inside the library module's grid view as individual images, what they actually are is a copy of an original physical file as a standalone image next to the original. However, a virtual copy is the manifestation of rendering instructions added to that original after we decided to affect the image in some way differently and then elected to save those changes as a virtual copy. Those rendering instructions are a key ancillary element of a raw file described as a sidecar, an attendant text file with an additional record of the settings we have saved, initially perhaps as snapshots and then as virtual copies. Metadata, not unlike the camera-generated data embedded within each image we record the first time we push the button. I'm not going to get lost too deep in the weeds here on all there is to know about virtual copies, as there's plenty available to those interested online. That's not the purpose of this screencast. However, the best visual example I have to show you within my own Lightroom catalog is this single frame detail of the Chaco Canyon complex of ruins in New Mexico. I was experimenting with a number of interesting presets and decided to save virtual copies of my favorite variations. But the most important point is how truly remarkable it is that Lightroom can generate a brand new physical image by utilizing a mix of both physical data and screen rendering instructions, simple metadata, in every sense of the term, a virtual copy. Now this is my process with images of a panoramic view at what's known as John Ford's Point in Monument Valley. I selected the first of 6 original RAW files and pressed the D key in order to take it into the Develop module. Now have a look here in the basic panel. Everything else in the right column is collapsed, even the histogram, because they have no relevance at this point. I putzed around with this series just a bit earlier, and though they all generally look and feel around about 1 f-stop underexposed, I found that they appeared more so if I took the existing exposure down by an additional 1/3 of an f-stop, so I set the exposure setting to -0.30. This will be my -1 f-stop exposure. Looking over at the left column here in the Develop module, you can see that Lightroom has recorded that adjustment I just made. As a time saver for the future, just in case I want to rebuild or reuse or somehow update what I have done for this faux HDR process I'm conducting on my image, it is my habit to save a snapshot. So you will see that for this initial setup, for my underexposure image, I first press the plus sign to the right of the Snapshots panel heading, and when a new snapshot window opens, I type -1 EV. The term EV stands for exposure value. Next, I need my normal exposure. So I go back to Exposure, click on the existing value of -0.30 to make it active, and then press the up arrow on my keyboard 10 times. The setting there now reads 0.70. Back to the Snapshots panel, and pressing the plus sign there again, I type the name of the new snapshot as Normal. Now I need my 1-stop overexposure, so back again to the exposure setting, click on the current equation of 0.70, and then once again to the up arrow and tap 10 times to get 1.70. One last time I go back to the snapshots panel, click on the plus sign and fill in +1 EV. Now I will need 2 virtual copies to interact with the original file I've been working with. So I go up to my first snapshot, my underexposure, and with it selected I use the keyboard shortcut Command plus the apostrophe key on a Mac, or Control and the apostrophe key on a PC. Instantly, Lightroom creates a virtual copy of my original. You know it's a virtual copy because you can see only one entry in the History panel, Create Virtual Copy, along with a date and timestamp in parentheses. Press the left arrow key on your keyboard to return to the original image file. You know it's your original because you have many more lines or entries of changes recorded there in the History panel. Now select the third snapshot, +1 EV, and create another virtual copy. Once again, use your left arrow key to navigate back to the original file, and this time I will select the second snapshot, my normal settings, and then stop. You do not need to make a virtual copy of this snapshot. I press the G key to move back to my library and its grid view of the folder my panorama building files reside in to see what I've done. There is my normal version of the file, rendered on the original file I started with, and then the 2 virtual copies as my under and overexposure files Lightroom will use to build a high dynamic range version of my single shot. I'm going to do the same process with the other images in this folder too. So now, as I'm going through this process in the background, understand, this sure is taking a lot of time, isn't it? If you have taken the time, had the opportunity, or remembered to make the 3 exposures in camera, unlike with this series, you wouldn't be faced with going through this process now in post-production. The faux HDR process is really only worthy of taking the time and making the effort if you were out shooting without a tripod and so didn't have the ability to set up and lock off to shoot 3 separate exposures in camera. Or you have something in your files like I have here in my location scouting archive, and you want to see if you can more easily pull out of an image or a series of images you intended to build a panorama out of. Or let's say you have a series of photographs of an event, or a special portrait, or a still life you think might become more interesting by experimenting with this variation on building high dynamic range images. But in this case, you'd be making the HDR with a single exposure. You're not going to get a child, or a pet, or a wedding party, or a family to sit perfectly still in order for you to pop off 3 separate exposures in camera to turn that moment into a high dynamic range version of it. And there is one more circumstance under which you might be willing to take the time and make the effort to build in post-production this variation of high dynamic range images. To experiment with a photograph, just as you might choose to spend time with a variety of presets here in Lightroom, saving various potential points of departure with their rendering actions, then finessing each and saving as snapshots or virtual copies in order to continue evolving the image later. Now there's bound to be someone out there who's going to say, why all the extra work here when I can achieve pretty much the same end result simply by intelligently using the developed settings in one well-exposed image instead? Fair enough. We'll next have a look at that in a follow-up movie. But now, all too often we are presented with tips and techniques for making short work out of images we develop in raw editors like Adobe's Camera Raw or Lightroom, getting it done because time is money. Now, some things, I think, are worthy of taking time when you find yourself more invested than simply pushing through images as if on a factory assembly line. The reason I find myself so excited about doing this process is that now, in Lightroom, I am able to come about as close as possible to building realistic-looking HDRs and have them ready to go for final creative editing right here inside my favorite post-processing application, Lightroom. As well, compared to the other much-respected, powerful, and quite useful HDR building applications I've worked with in the past, both Photomatix and Nik's HDR Pro, I found that I'm more likely to get the sort of realism I want out of my image processing using the Photo Merge feature in Lightroom now instead. Please don't get me wrong, I have no axe to grind with enhancing photographs, with adding a bit of surrealism by way of plug-in effects and split toning or whatever. I'm just so sick and tired of seeing over-the-top versions of this sort of imagery, overly cooked photographs being passed off as fine art. All the 3 exposure sets have been completed for my setup process. Now it's time to create the HDRs from these 6 raw files and their attendant virtual copies. I select my first here, and it's 2 virtual copies. See the little upturned corner at the bottom left of those 2 images? This is a good visual reminder that you are working with a virtual copy. I select the first thumbnail, then holding down the Shift key, I click the third in the series to select them all. Then, with my cursor floating above the 3 selected thumbnails, I right-click or Control-click on a Mac to pop open an options dialog, navigating to Photo Merge, and then choosing HDR from the 2 options there. Lightroom will open up the Photo Merge dialog, and in this case, I leave the default settings as you see here: Auto Align, Auto Tone, and the Deghost amount left at none. Then I move on to the next series, and then the next, the 4th, 5th, and then the last series for completing 6 HDR images I will next use to build my high dynamic range panorama. Sometimes Lightroom places the resulting HDRs in sensible order. Sometimes it does not. So after all the images are rendered, it is my habit to reset the order from left to right, then select all the HDRs that will be used to build the panorama and first press the number 1 on my keyboard to assign each of them a 1-star rating. Then, another visual cue for myself, potentially returning to a series one day in the future, I then press the number 9 to assign the series the blue color label. These are just visual reminders for me. There is no need for you to do the same if you find it inconvenient or superfluous to how you work. One last thing before I end the screencast and save the panorama build for the next movie. It is important for you to note, all the normal post-production finessing is conducted on the completed panorama, or at least that's how I do it. I do not tweak my faux HDR single-frame versions of my original series when they have been merged. In this, the first part of the overall process of making a high dynamic range panorama from a series of single photographs. All my tweaks, finessing both shadows and highlights, color adjustments, contrast, clarity, which is what most HDR building software does with a combination of tone mapping and structure adjustments, a final exposure adjustment, and spotting out imperfections from dust on the camera's sensor or something else I want to get rid of, all are completed after I built my intended panorama from the HDRs I built through the process I have just outlined.